In this episode of Project Carhaven, I make use of a claw hammer, a dead blow hammer, a palm hammer, and set fire to suspension components to make them better. Hi, I'm Andy. This is Project Carhaven, and today we're working on replacing all the suspension components in the rear, at least, of the Celica. When I checked the fuel cell mounting, the rear showed quite a bit of bounce. The front passenger side is even more pronounced, and the front driver's side is quite flat and not responsive. Well, there is quite a lot of wheel gap, so while we're replacing suspension components, we'll lower it as well. So some lowering springs from King Springs, which are to suit Holden Gemini, but do apparently fit these quite well, quite a few other cars. They are the KMF LO4s. They're still wrapped, obviously, but I will do a comparison once I get these old springs out. Going to need shorter shock absorbers to suit. These are apparently for a Holden Kingswood, but will also fit this. How, I don't know. A white line adjustable Panhard rod to suit the lowering of the car and get rid of that bent one. And lower and upper trailing control arm bushes, along with all the other bushes to suit the rest of the car, to go in to firm up all the slop that's in the rear end. Now it's a matter of getting in there, removing the shocks, springs, Panhard rod and trailing arms, which will then detach the rear end from the car other than the drive shaft. So that'll need to be lowered on the jack, and it'll give me access to get in there and replace everything. Get in and unlock these two from each other. Got to support the shaft of the shock absorber while undoing the lower nut with a spanner. Take the bushing off the top, then repeat for the other side. Apparently that's it. Got the diff supported by the jack. Bolt out. Shock removed. Put the bolt back so I don't lose it. It's a bit of a side-by-side comparison. New shock. Push it down. It should return. And the old one. Nothing. Junk. Thank you. And now that the shock absorbers are out, I should be able to lower the jack. The rear end should lower down, and then we can get the springs free. Very tight. Springs out. So here we have stock springs are out, replacement springs. Fair bit of difference in there. Change these insulators over. Cool. Next, get the Panhard rod out of here. So as you can see, the Panhard rod's pretty bent. That bushing there is actually pretty wallowed out, not in good condition, and so that can disappear. Nice new straight adjustable Panhard rod The purpose of this is to keep the rear wheels central to the vehicle, and when you lower the car, it changes the distance between the two attachment points. So you need this adjustability to bring those wheels back to center of the car. That bent one there meant that this driver's side wheel was sitting out way further and the passenger side was sitting in. This will take care of keeping the wheels central while the car is lowered. Well, that's the trailing arms removed. Now I need to work on getting the bushings out. Typically the easiest way to get them out is by burning them out. Just drill a few holes, fill it with a bit of terps, set them on fire. 53-year-old rubber is bound to be less than pristine. As you can see, the bushes are cracked, split and warped, and even stretched sideways so the arm is no longer central. So the rubber will either burn away completely or it will turn into crumbly ash, which will be much easier to remove than, even though this is old crusty rubber, still a bit bound to those control arms. It's still smouldering, but as you can see, it's very crusty and weak. That should come out easily. Alright, so the bushes are all torched out of these arms and then blasted out with a wire brush on a drill, mostly. These bushings have a shell, which doesn't need to be there for the new bushes. So the way to get these out is to undo the blade off a hacksaw, feed it in, tighten it back on, and start cutting through till this is weak enough, hammer in a screwdriver, and pry the shell out. Also, need to hit the outside of these with a wire brush now because all that fire torched all the paint that was on them. There's no point going blind from a wire brush. Make sure to wear safety glasses. I feel like I shouldn't have to say that. Well, now that the arms are all nice and clean, it's just a matter of getting the hacksaw, loosening the blade, fitting it into the control arm, tighten the blade again. Now that the hacksaw's installed, we can cut through that shell. Change of plan. I'm going to paint these first, then I'll remove those shells so the inner surface is clean and I won't have to worry about removing overspray. And also, I need to find another solution for cutting the shells out because my hacksaw blades are about as sharp as a welding rod. Change of plan complete. The shells have now been removed using jigsaw. I wanted to use the hacksaw because it gives more control and less likely to cut into the body of the control arm. I had to use this very carefully to make sure I didn't score them up, which then allowed me to punch these out. I was then able to clean up the inside with a flat disc on a drill, like that. And now that they're clean, I can fit the bushes. This gets placed inside once it's fitted to the control arm. So now it's a matter of fitting this guy into this using a vise.
1 hour later.
Alright, so the bushes are all fitted. I couldn't show you that because there's no light in my shed. Now we need to fit the sleeves into the bushes, lubricate with some molly grease. Just using the tip of a small paintbrush, apply the grease to the inside of the bush, and importantly, lubricate the shaft before inserting. Makes it much easier. Right, so now the faces and the mating surfaces have all been greased. It's a matter of getting the arms and fitting them back in. Right, the trailing arms are in, the bolts are in, they're not done up yet. I'll wait until it's back on the ground so it's sitting at right height before I tighten them to the correct torque spec, which I'll need to go and find in the manuals. But before I do all of that, and get the suspension put back in while the rear axle is hanging quite low, I'm going to put the original exhaust back on. It's only temporary. I will be putting a full exhaust system on this car one day, but in the meantime, instead of having this lying around in the yard, I think I'd rather have it back on the car and make it a little bit more eco-friendly when I move it around. New exhaust flange gasket. So now that the exhaust is temporarily fixed in place, the next step is to get the Panhard rod installed. In order to do that accurately, I'm going to jack the diff up to about the height where it should be when the car is sitting on the ground, and then adjusting it using some string line to make sure that it's sitting central on the body of the car. Hardware out, quick clean. Poly bushes, get the molly grease. This is only temporarily fitted. We got to measure first. So in order to get an even measurement on either side, simply take a plumb line or a line with some weight on it, line it up with the center of the axle. I'm going to tape it on for ease of use. So once the line has stopped swinging, take a measurement from the center of the hub to the string, compare that measurement to the other side, add the two together, divide it by 2, and whatever that number is, that's the number you want to hit here, which will then match the other side. Axle is central. Well, I did really want that adjustment to be out of spec so I could show you how to adjust it. But because the trailing arms have new bushes in it, it's holding the rear end pretty square, and those measurements are actually equal on both sides. So previously, the original Panhard rod being bent meant that it was pulling the axle this way. Let me explain. So I'll draw this from the perspective of looking from the back of the car forwards. So this will be the driver's side, this will be the passenger side. The guards, rear guards or fenders are here, wheels sit here, axle through the center here. The Panhard rod attaches to the chassis on the driver's side to the axle on the passenger. With that bent rod, it effectively shorten the distance of this Panhard rod. In turn, it pulls on this point towards the chassis. The axle shifts this way, reducing this distance, increasing this distance. It's no longer central. So by taping the string to either side of the car, like so, we can then measure these distances. What we want to do is make them equal. For example, with that bent Panhard rod and the axle pushed this way, this distance shrunk will just make up, say that was 100 mil, and it made that one 140 millimeters. In order to figure out what the measurement needs to be, we need to add these two together, which would give us 240, divide by 2 equals 120. If we make it 120 on either side here, That axle will be central to the body, and that's where the adjustable Panhard rod comes into play. Okay, so once the car's back on the ground, you can tighten up the bolts for the control arms, re-measure to make sure the axle's sitting central, adjust as necessary, and then move on to the next task. But for now, moving forward, we need to get the shocks and springs put back in. So the rear axle is no longer sitting on the jack. It's fully supported by the framework of the car. Kingswood shocks and Gemini springs fit perfectly. That spring is not flopping around, and that shock is at full extension. So Holden parts fit Toyotas apparently. There's definitely a difference under here because there is much less room for activities when it's sitting on the ground. Now this is just tightening up, it's not to torque spec yet. As you can see, the gap here is now significantly less than when we started. Perfect. Well, now that the bolts to the control arms are sort of tightened up, they need to be done up to spec, which is where the Bible comes in. Chassis module, body and engine. I've had these books for over 30 years now, and I wouldn't part with them ever. They were all well looked after by the time I got my hands on them, and I've taken very good care of them since. The numbers I need are going to be probably inside this one here. Right, so got the lower and upper control arm. Torque specs are the same for both. Using a 6-pointed 19mm socket, I'm going to aim for about 100 foot-pounds.
20 minutes later.
All the arms are torqued down properly. It's a matter of setting up this plumb line again, rechecking the measurements from the hub out to the outer edge, making sure the axle's central, and then lock the Panhard rod into place when that's correct. Well, that measurement hasn't changed since last time, but I'll double check the other side just to make sure. Right, well, the measurement is confirmed to match on both sides. Now it's a matter of locking that Panhard rod, and I think the rear suspension setup is done. The Panhard rod torque specs that on the axle is 25 to 40 foot-pounds, so I'll go up to about 40 and then back it off so I can get the cotter pin through the castellated nut. The connection at the frame is to be between 50 and 65 foot-pounds. Well, I think that's it for this episode. Rear suspension's all done, nicely lowered, makes the front end look horrible. Don't mind about the paint, talking about the level. In the next one, I'll probably work on that or brakes. I'm not going to start the interior, I know that. Also, I've got to check to see if this exhaust is actually plugged or not. See you in the next one.